Hello, hello, and welcome back to our afternoon program here in the Blue Track hashtag API Secure 2023. Really excited to get this afternoon going. We've got a lot of really great speakers lined up. And again, if you have any questions for the speaker, put it in the Q&A in the chat. And we'll take a look at those just before we do a Q&A section, and we can kind of ask the speaker some questions. So right up first this afternoon, or afternoon for me, I don't know where you guys are, but we have Jeremy Ventura, CISO at ThreatX, here to talk to us about the importance of real-time protection in API security. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, Trish, how are you? Thanks for the introduction. Perfect. Well, hi, everyone. And again, thank you to Apisecure for having me speak today at this session. Hopefully, this is an entertaining one. I know it's 10:15 a.m. for me. I'm located in Southern California. So hopefully not everyone's just got off their lunch break and has to listen to me first now. But Trish, again, thank you for introducing me. Just a quick little background about myself for everybody. As Trish mentioned, my name is Jeremy Ventura. I am currently the field CISO at ThreatX. So really my job and responsibility as a field CISO is pretty much the delivery and content creation of all and everything thought leadership. And that could be anything from specifically API security to different security topics in general. Could be talking about different things around ransomware or diversity inclusion or career growth. And then with that, also a lot of my role is making sure that I expand the global brand of ThreatX to our customers, our prospects, and our partners alike, to making sure that we're providing accurate and consistent information across the industry. A little bit on my background, I've worked for many different security vendors in the past, from email security, vulnerability management. I started my career as incident response as a consultant. I've worked internal security, and now I've got the opportunity to be the field CISO here at ThreatX, which is super exciting. But anyway, without further ado, let's see. I'm going to open up the PowerPoint slide. In today's session, I really want to focus on the importance of real-time protection when it comes to API security. And so why I really want to focus on this today was I think, I'm actually pretty new to API security in general. Like I said, I've worked for many different vendors and different avenues. I've actually implemented different API security technologies, but working actually for an API security platform or product is a new one for me. And, I think why I want to talk about specifically real-time protection is sometimes in this market, we've got a lot of vendors and sometimes a lot of marketing lingo where we can get a little confused about where do we focus? Where do we prioritize when it comes to API security? I know there's been some great talk tracks yesterday. There's some great ones coming up later after me as well. And all of them focus a little different from each other, but sometimes that can be actually confusing. And what I mean by confusing is sometimes we can think and prioritize about shifting left, which I know we've heard that acronym, right? How do we build API security scanning or vulnerability testing when it comes incorporated into that CI/CD pipeline? With that being said, though, and while that's all great, and I'll talk about kind of the pros and cons of all that, there also has to be an emphasis on what it means to, let's call it shift right, or API protection, API real-time blocking. What happens when those APIs are actually in production and your developers are creating code and, for example, an API might get attacked by an attacker, right? How do we get that real-time blocking? How do we correlate that information? So without further ado, today I want to get into kind of what we're going to cover. And the first thing I want to talk about is kind of the agenda of today's talk track. There's really three main points that I want to go through. The first is kind of getting a baseline and an understanding of what are some of the challenges as a CISO, I've worked for other companies. What are some of the challenges that we face as an organization? What other prospects and customers face that I get to talk to on an everyday basis? And specifically tying that around API protection. From there, I'm going to actually go into a little bit about the company I work for, ThreatX, and some of the case studies. And I hope a lot of it can kind of relate and at least shine or put a spotlight on some of the different attacks that we're seeing. And third, I want to do a little bit more around some of the importance of that real-time blocking with some tips and best practice and recommendations. Again, this is not a ThreatX pitch. This is more of, living in the field, working in the field, having the kind of responsibilities that I do and the visibility into other security organizations and teams. What are some of the tips and best practices that everyone off this call can look forward to or at least implement within their organizations? Now, before I actually jump to kind of the beginning of this presentation, I think it would be a really good time to really break down who ThreatX is, the company that I work for. ThreatX is an API security company. We do focus on real-time protection and application protection as well. We were created in 2015, kind of as a next-gen WAF, or I think the Gartner Magic Quadrant is WAP, Web Application API Protection. We started at that, we are deployed architecturally as a reverse proxy, hence the legacy and traditional WAF approach. But we also, over the years, have listened to our customers and prospects and said, how do we continue to develop our platform, our services, and really incorporate the best use of where the evolution of APIs, for example, are going? So as you go through this presentation, like again, this is not a ThreatX pitch, but I do want to talk just high level about who ThreatX is and kind of the background, so a lot of this actually connects and makes sense. So the first thing I want to get into is, we talk a lot about this, and I'm sure almost every talk track so far has kind of talked about, why are APIs representing such a rich environment for attackers? Now, most of us at this conference, right, being API secure, we come here to learn. We pretty much all have I'm going to make the assumption we all have a pretty good understanding of what an API actually is. So I'm not going to spend the time, obviously, at API secure to explain what an API is, because we assume that we know that. But why are they so targeted? And, I think as we get into this, every modern application pretty much uses an API or APIs, or is actually an API themselves. Gartner has come out and actually said in 2023, all B2B transactions, 50% of that, at least 50%, is going to be an API. I think what we're seeing, and there's other research firms out there and analyst relations that are kind of putting out different metrics that kind of coincide with Gartner's 50%. I've actually even seen one recent that says 80% of all traffic right now on the web is due to an API, whether it's a pull, a get, or a push, right? And I think what that means is because organizations were so heavily reliant on APIs of how we develop, how we build our products, how we service our customers, this also creates this huge, huge target on the back of APIs for attackers, right? And I think you can see some of the different metrics and charts here, but some of the different growth of explosions that we've seen, right? And this, I think for a lot of the conference goers here, is a little bit of an obvious. But, when it comes into this, what are some of the challenges? Like, why are attackers actually going after this? And what we're seeing is attackers aren't just necessarily going after an API just to say, oh, let me go get that vulnerability and see if I can disclose some information or sensitive information. That may be true, but what we're seeing is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, is organizations using, or attackers using, different phases, techniques, and tactics to actually target APIs or target the application itself. And we kind of call that here a multi-mode or a multi-vector attack. And that means it could be literally different layers, like the 7 different layers. It could be a layer 7 DDoS, but also maybe a layer 4. And how do I attack an organization from different entry points, right? Different attack vectors. And the one thing I will mention is it doesn't necessarily just have to be APIs or applications, right? We're starting to see APIs leading to ransomware attacks. Or maybe if I can pull sensitive information from an organization's API, and maybe I've got now name and email address, I can then target that organization through phishing, for example, or social engineering. So what we're starting to see is this kind of balance when attackers making sure that they're going after organizations, right? They're doing a lot of probing. They're doing a lot of reconnaissance on that kill chain spectrum. And today, that's what I want to cover, right? What does that mean? But also, what does that mean to do real-time blocking? The last thing I'll leave on this slide is when I talk to a lot of organizations, one of the biggest questions I always ask is, and this kind of goes to that shift left approach, is, where do you struggle with APIs? A lot of times people in organizations don't actually know that answer. And I think a lot of that comes down to a little bit more on that shift left approach, but I'll use the word visibility, right? I think we hear that word, not just in APIs, but security in general. And it's kind of it's not an easy problem to solve, right? Of course, in APIs, we can rely on schemas. We can rely on whether it's reverse proxies, inline solutions, right? Organizations kind of and products do things a little bit different of each other, or even API gateways or WAFs. But it's not always a perfect solution. And we see that over and over. And not to pick out, and this is not to me picking out T-Mobile. I actually have a lot of good friends that work and have worked for that security and piracy organization. But just 2 months ago, right? We saw an incident here with one of the largest telecommunication organizations in the world where there was an API that didn't need authorization or authentication that an attacker was able, or let's say an entity was able to access, right? And pulling PII information such as name, address, email, phone, date of birth, account number that you see there. But I think when it looks sometimes to the scale and some of the severity of this, now, we could take one approach and say, okay, is my information already out there? Like, is my personal email address and name through other data incidents or data breaches already out there? Probably, right? I think we can all assume yes, that is to the answer. But where it's coming from is APIs have access to a lot of information, right? Not just external information of an organization, but also internal, right? Or private APIs as well. And again, this is not to pick on T-Mobile by any means. This is more of a showcase that we're in the news. API security is absolutely in the news every week, every month, almost sometimes every day. And I think when it comes to, especially when I talk to CISOs at that level, it's really trying to bridge that gap and educate a lot of individuals on how severe API security is to an organization. A lot of times people go, Jeremy, I gotta do my patching. I gotta do, infrastructure. I'm going through this digital transformation or cloud security. That's all great. That's all fine. But when you think about all the applications, especially in a business or organization that provides services, I like to even say, do you have a website? Most every brand today, if not all of them, has some type of web server or web application, right? Hosted or not. And a lot of that's APIs in the background. And so when we start to really educate, when we start to really bridge that gap, it's really an interesting question. And of course, with this situation, right, we can talk a lot about different use cases from Peloton, Venmo, Facebook, Twitter, USPS, right? We're seeing global organizations, global brands be affected with APIs. And it really stems back to the original problem. It comes back a lot of times, was it a lack of visibility? Was it just a misconfiguration or misuse of API? Was I doing the correct, let's call it the OWASP top 10? We'll talk a little bit more about how attackers are expanding beyond that. But, was it something like a broken business logic? Or, was it stolen credentials from another data breach, like a supply chain incident that was able to get me access into the API, for example? So, as we kind of tumble, it's not to be so pessimistic in this presentation, but we all kind of have an appreciation being at this conference and listening to these talk tracks where we know, and that's why we're here, right? We're here to learn, but we're also here to educate in a sense of APIs it's not if and when. We hear that all the time. API security and API incidents and breaches are happening right now. And to global brands, to small and medium business organizations as well. And so really taking that proactive approach of how do we grapple this from the shift left all the way to the shift right is really key. So with that being said, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I started to mention a little bit about OWASP top 10 and kind of where attackers are going. But, I think when it comes to complexity, we're hitting strides now as attackers where we are starting to look at different things. I was just reading an article actually just yesterday where we talked something about solver services. And I'm not sure if everybody knows what solver service is, but just for a quick explanation, it's a way to, the solver, take the R out, just solve, right? Solve or bypass existing bot technologies or solutions. So as an individual, I can go in the darknet, for example, and under $500 pay for one of these services or an attack as a service and bypass, for example, an organization's typical bot solution or even WAF solution. And so what's happening is we're seeing hacking and attacks becoming just easier, low cost to attack an organization. And attackers are getting smarter. They're learning, okay, if you have this solution in place, maybe I can use a solver service. And once you start to become a little bit identified, maybe they change their attack pattern, right? They're going a different route and trying to figure out, how can I become invisible to this organization and not get picked up by one of the different solutions that they may or may not have in place. So we talk a lot about kind of different services or different darknet opportunities that attackers can go and get in attack organizations. But what we're also finding is a lot of the technologies that we definitely have in place are really focused on your traditional OWASP top 10. And I know there is now, after 4 years, the 2023 version coming out, has come out. And I know there's already articles and blogging kind of posting and doing comparisons and contrasting. And while it's very important, right, I think as organizations are kind of in their elementary or fundamental stages of implementing an API security program, focusing on OWASP Type 10 is a great starting point. But what we know is it's not the end all be all, right? Organizations are coming in through different ways of bots or DDoS protection, or even one thing that we're talking a lot about is containers and runtime security, right? Containers a lot of them run on APIs of how they're pulled and how they're pushed to different developing engineering teams. And so what we're starting to see is this evolution of, in the, 2015, 2016, we had applications, and now there's a huge focus on APIs. And from there, we're kind of branching out now into 2023 and beyond of where else are APIs developed or implemented within my organization. And that could be at the container level. That could be at a supply chain, for example, that we partner with or we integrate with. And so as we're going through this, what we're seeing is a lot of the solutions and technologies in place only focus on that OS top 10. Like I said, it's a good starting point, but it's not the end all be all, right? And you kind of see that with that iceberg diagram there. We've got a lot of different tactics and techniques that attackers are using that security technologies and tools, and even more important, resources and people can't keep up with. I'll leave this slide with one more quote that typically one of the first things here at ThreatX is when we work with our prospects before they become customers. The one thing is we always ask them the famous old question: how many APIs do you think you have? And that could be public, private, internal, external, whatever the use case might be. On average, we have stats that say somewhere between 8 and 10x more APIs are actually in that organization once we run an assessment, right? Once we do some catalog and some discovery work. And it's not always what's actually, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, it's not always what's in the schema that's going to find things. We talk a lot about rogue and zombie APIs, right? And what that means for individuals that don't know is, for example, or you can even call it shadow APIs, where APIs that the organization doesn't even know exist in the environment. Maybe they were supposed to be decommissioned years ago, or maybe they've run their use of, they're in production, but they run their ability or use case or the length of life. And I think we've got an interesting challenge here where I know we just came out with a study recently where we said when it comes to APIs, specifically on visibility, what's your biggest concern? What keeps you up at night? And it was around rogue and zombie APIs. We don't know what we don't know. And that's not just APIs again, right? That can apply to a lot of different security avenues and products and sectors within the industry, but specifically with APIs, I mean, we're talking hundreds, thousands. I mean, we've got organizations up to hundreds of thousands of APIs, if not more. And getting a handle on who owns it, what is it doing, what is the risk strategy or prioritization, that really becomes a challenge. And so with that, I think we need to expand. We need to look beyond about how can we get started, but also start to implement solutions. And that doesn't necessarily mean products as well, even training with our employees to make sure we're not just keeping the lights on, but we feel like we're getting a little bit more advanced or proactive when it comes to API security. So I mentioned this earlier, and this is kind of one of the last slides before I go into some of the different use cases, but I mentioned before the threat of what we call multi-vector, or some organizations even call it multi-mode. For this simplicity, we'll call it multi-vector. And I mentioned before, it's really targeting an organization at multiple different attack patterns or techniques, or even within different layers of the organization. And I think, when we look back in history, the challenge with APIs are really a lot of the same challenges we've historically seen with applications. Where are the APIs being used? Where are the applications being used again? We talk about things like login and authentication. There may be, for example, a web component that's probing to seeing kind of what's happening behind the scenes of an organization's. But we can also see the range from bots and DDoS and botnet attacks that are kind of attacking organizations or dispersing through other technologies. I think for an attacker nowadays, it's become, I mentioned it earlier in kind of slide, I said hacking has become easier, but it really has. A lot of the tools that the attackers have are the tools that we use internally as organizations. And that's a real life thing that I think sometimes as security professionals, we forget that the attackers know the same technologies that we implement within our organization. And, that becomes a challenge if they can crack that, right? Again, going through solver services or other different types of information. So I think when we look at the threat of multi-vector attacks, right, we're not just talking about static IPs anymore, right? We have technology that's really, let's call it, like, even from a WAF standpoint, I've implemented multiple WAFs over my time through different organizations. And I think the one constant challenge we see is everything's typically signature-based or static. So we're looking at one call and we're saying, now I know WAF technologies have obviously grown and tried to address this challenge, but historically it's been, let's take a look at this IP address. Is it good? Let it through. Is it bad? Based upon our information or Rolodex of bad IPs or blacklisted IPs. Oh, it's bad. Okay, block it. And what we see a lot of times is that creates a lot of false positives and false negatives, right? I think when we look for security solutions, we look for technologies, a lot of it is how do I reduce the time and effort my team spends on some of these challenges while also increasing productivity for the business, right? We got to remember at the end of the day, security is truly a business problem. And when you specifically think about APIs and applications, right, that's consumer typically fed or at least consumed by our customers or our services that we provide. And so when we think about API security, we need to start looking at the focus of API security is a business problem, right? It has to be at the top of minds when it comes to CISOs, CIOs, including the C-level executive and board. And how we do that, it's a little challenging, right? Because I think right now it's not as easy as saying ransomware, right? Ransomware, we've got boards everywhere being like, oh, let's do cyber insurance. Let's put, attack patterns in or solutions to mitigate a ransomware attack if it happened. APIs are here, as I mentioned before, and they're coming. And so I think, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. As we see more incidents and breaches, of course, we don't want to do that. But as we do see that, I think this conversation is absolutely going to pick up. I think it really comes down to who owns it. I mentioned again, is it security? Is it development? Is it engineering? Is it infrastructure? Is it DevOps or DevSecOps? So depending on the organization, it could be multiple different people or teams. And figuring that out is super critical and super important. Now, the last thing I'll say about multi-vector attacks is really when you think about multi-vector, again, I mentioned a couple of times, like it usually includes various phases, combination of attack techniques that's executed differently or over a period of time. And what I'm going to do is actually going through a couple of different examples of kind of what we've seen and what to look out for within your organizations or when you're talking to your customers or products as well. So I think the big thing I want to get out of multi-vector is we talked a little bit about visibility, but how do we start to correlate a lot of the data that's happening within our organization? Because there are multiple things that are happening. How do we correlate that, make sense of that, right? I always talk about how do we take the data, make it to information, turn it into insights, and then lastly is how do we produce actions or decisions based upon that? So as we go through some of the different examples, we'll kind of talk about that. The last thing I'm going to talk about before the examples, and I promise I'll get to them, is just bots in general. I think we focus as an industry a lot about APIs. And again, when you think about some of the different attack patterns in the history of kind of how organizations are being hit, a lot of this actually comes through bots. And I mentioned before, I'm not going to repeat it around solver services and going and bypassing existing bot solutions. But again, it's about how do we take bots, or let's even call it botnets, and start to correlate that information and really, break it down to understand who the attacker is, right? Because bot solutions and bot attacks that are happening now from hackers, they're not just single IPs, right? They're obfuscating IPs or that rotating IPs are coming in everywhere. And so they're distributing those IPs to evade those different thresholds within certain technologies that are implemented within companies. And so the one thing I will say, and I just want to throw up this slide, is it kind of says in my tagline right in the bottom there, but bots do present a new challenge for protecting APIs, right? It's, there's a lot of API like siloed security solutions out there. When you're looking for different solutions, when you're looking for different technologies, if it works for that organization, do think about potentially how does that API security company handle bots, right? Because I'm not saying they're two in the same, but a lot of times what you'll see is bot attacks or DDoS, even DDoS attacks are very, very correlated when we see API attacks actually happening as well. So I promise I'll get into some of the use cases. And so I always like telling, when I do presentations, different stories of different use cases. I've got two today. And as I mentioned before, ThreatX is not just an API security, WAF, DDoS, and bot solution. We actually tie the entire platform around a 24/7 managed service, or we like to call it protection as a service. In security worlds, we call it a SOC, right? So you can outsource a lot of your detection capabilities, rule creation, the incident response to our SOC that we'll handle from tier 1 all the way up to potentially tier 4. And what's interesting about that is we have a lot of insight and visibility into organizations and industries around the world and how they are being attacked, but also how we're helping them. And so what I want to do today is present two different use cases of that multi-vector attack. They're actually both very, very similar, but there's a couple different things I want to kind of get across here. And so the first one is actually, this is a customer of ours, and it is a large online retailer. This was happening around the holidays. And what we saw was these micro, I'll call it micro, I think I put periodic, but micro DDoS attacks. So we saw, based upon our rule engines, based upon our SOC, that this online retailer was starting to get hit with a little bit, or at least probed with what looked like to be these micro short frequency DDoS attacks. And so what really was happening from an attacker standpoint is they're doing the reconnaissance, right? They're saying like, okay, how can I evade potential detection of whatever this company's using? It was ThreatX, but whatever they're using, how can I start to ping or probe that organization and not get on a blacklist, for example, and not get completely blocked? From there, what was also interesting is minutes later, we were seeing a high increase of actually login failure attempts from their actual website. Users, online retailer, right? You got to put in, if you have for example, an account, you got to put your sign in, right? You got to put your email address and your password, maybe some multi-factor, some CAPTCHA in there. But what we were seeing is a unusual increased login attempts. And so from there, we have to now make a decision of, is that normal traffic? It's the holidays. So a lot of these retail brands are being, their sites are being visited way more than usual, right? Because it's, the holidays and people are buying things for their loved ones. And so, we've got this periodic potential DDoS attack happening. We're seeing this increased login failure. And then the organization starts to actually say, hey, ThreatX, we're actually seeing this high rate of rebate fraud. And so what they did is they had like an actual, like a rebate website, and for individuals that could go and like get a rebate on certain things. And they saw some online stuff that was just, it looked so abnormal to them that they said, there's something going on here. So from the SOC, right, putting the right technologies in place, we were able to do things like TLS fingerprinting, IP interrogation, tar pitting, right? So how do I slow down the attackers to potentially get them to go away, but also see what are they going to do in response to that? And the goal here of the attacker was really to bypass or BGP routing. And for people that don't know what BGP, that's Border Gateway Protocol, which is pretty much the protocol that underlies the global routing system of the internet. So it's how a packet gets routed to a network from one other network. And so what they were really trying to do is trying to figure out, like, how can I get around that to evade that detection? Meanwhile, their whole goal here, and you can see from different attacks, right? The periodic DDoS, the authorization, authentication of login failure attempts. Oh, there's someone who might be attacking our rebate website. Multi-vector attacks, right? We're going after, it's not just a DDoS attack, right? We're using different tactics and techniques to potentially distract the security team for maybe something that was bigger, maybe a phishing email, for example, or a phishing campaign, or even something bigger like, again, a major DDoS attack once they've done some reconnaissance. And so, when it comes to applying best of breed technologies, I think for organizations, we need to take a step back again and look at, how do I block these attacks? Again, it comes back to, how do I block these attacks in real life? And, when we look at that, we need to make sure that we're implementing the best technologies and services that work for our organizations, of course. But we can't just create more alerts. As you can imagine, if you got a periodic DDoS attack, you get these increased login, it could potentially, another solution in there could just be creating volume of alerts, right? And what is that going to do? That's going to distract, and that was their goal, distract the security team to be like, oh, let's go focus here now. Oh, let's go focus here now. Oh, we got something else going on, right? And so I think how you correlate that information based upon some of the different attributes and techniques, like I mentioned, TLS fingerprinting, IP fingerprinting, tar pitting, rate limiting, there's a bunch out there, but even NetFlow capture. But like, as you're doing that, how can I understand the attacker? Not just this single IP or IP addresses that are hitting my organization, but the attacker themselves. How do I correlate that information down? And so that's kind of when you're looking for solutions and technologies to really figure out, does that vendor or does that service provide that? Or can I do that some other way that doesn't take a lot of time and effort? The last kind of tale from the sock here, I really like this one. This is actually an interesting one. This is one of our stories that we kind of repeat a couple times because it really does display and show kind of the threat of a multi-vector attack. So kind of a little background on this one. This was actually a company that creates video games. And what they were doing is they were in the development stage of actually launching a new video game, right? Or let's just call it a new product. And what was happening was the attacker actually hired or got a foreign botnet, and they were about to launch and did launch a large account takeover attack. And so as they're doing this, and as this account taker attack is going on, what they actually did was they attempted to actually exploit the API endpoints in a more kind of stealthy, invisible manner. And since large-scale account takeover attacks doesn't necessarily change between requests, even though IPs potentially are rotating, it's actually typically for most solutions actually relatively easy to actually detect that pattern and then stop the attack. But what was happening was they were doing reconnaissance. They were doing and testing the actual development system and these APIs to see, when this organization actually goes to production, can I attack them even bigger and stronger again? And, once the larger attack actually stopped, our engines were able to look for different unusual attack patterns or different attributes in there. But what's happening was later during this actual production phase, when this video game company actually launched and went into prod with this game, then again, the attacker came back. And even though it was all different types of IPs, device user IDs, agent strings, they were actually were attempting to do a larger account takeover attack to actually go after the discovered API vulnerabilities that they found in the discovery. And so, I think what we seen was actually a reasonable, call it a reasonable benign foreign botnet. And they were actually pretty successful modifying their attack vectors. But originally, we were actually blocking at that bot level, and we did that all based upon different risk scores. So that's another kind of characteristic there. But it didn't seem quite as severe. And again, what they were really trying to do is probe those APIs that were all sitting in development or behind the scenes. And looking at things like what level of authorization, authentication was there. Not all vulnerabilities from this organization were addressed from development into production. And so, the challenge, I think, when it comes to a lot of this stuff is you don't want to block legitimate users, right? And I think when you look at some of the patterns and some of the recognitions and attributes of exploitation attempts, it's really focused on how can I correlate, again, that information and really make sense of who the attacker is. And so we did different things, again, like the fingerprinting, the signatures as well. But over time, we've got a good history and good base of correlated threat intelligence to say, that looks very common to what this is happening right now. Why were they going after the same API endpoints or going after the same vulnerabilities? Or why are they choosing a different account takeover exploitation attempt, for example, again? And so we were obviously able to, I think the big thing here is, again, it's in the tagline, track the behavior over time and then correlate that and say, okay, no, we know, eliminate those false positives. We know this is actually the same attacker, or at least taking the same patterns of trying to attack that organization, even if it came in from multiple different avenues or techniques. And so from there, able to actually do some of this real-time blocking. So without that all being said, I got a couple slides left here. But, again, I kind of mentioned, when it comes to protecting APIs, I've mentioned this probably 2 or 3 times already, but it really does matter when you focus on the attacker itself, right? Understanding really what that attacker profile, we can call it, is. So a lot of the times when you see different technology solutions out there, one of the things you want to do is you want to look at, does it do something around risk scoring? Risk scoring actually kind of can lead to the prioritization of how I should focus on what first, right? Should my team go focus on potentially taking this API or even potentially this application down, or, fixing it offline or fixing a vulnerability or patching something? And so when you look at this kind of risk-based algorithm within a technology, really making sure that it understands a couple different things, right? I like to use the acronym BAD, and it's all about baselining. So understanding your APIs today and your applications today. What does normal flow look like for different times of years? Who owns that? What is the normal behavior and patterns of who's authenticating, who's authorizing to these APIs, for example? Who has access to that? From there, making sure that solution or technology can do the A in bad, which is anomalies, right? And anomalies don't necessarily have to be always bad, right? And I think that's where sometimes organizations always say, oh, that looks off, let's go and block that. And how many times have we all sat in a call and somebody's gotten an IP address, for example, blocked when it should have never been blocked. And so I think when we look at that, it's really finding the anomaly detection, right? Making sure that company or service has a strong algorithm where we can say and look at, okay, this looks odd, right? This looks unique to my environment. Let's dig into this more. Do I have the attributes and characteristics to say and make the final, which is in bad, the D, decision, right? Can I go and decide to block that or put, for example, something on a watch list or a challenge list or a block list? And so I think when you're looking through that, right, I always like to kind of give that, and you can use that acronym in multiple different facets of cybersecurity. Bad, baseline, anomaly detection. I think if technology and solutions across the across the security, not just API space, can do that, you probably got a good partner or a good sense of kind of what's going on within your environment. Again, it's all about tracking, right? So can I continuously evaluate the risk and the response and the behaviors of kind of what's going on to my environment? And then I mentioned it already a couple different times, but looking at different things like behavioral fingerprinting, looking at different things like attack patterns, right? We know attacks come in many different flavors, right? We've got standard discovery and exploitation. So identifying vulnerable APIs behind logins, for example. We've got automated attacks that are rapidly exploiting vulnerabilities before they're even addressed. We have the low and slow, which is a lot of the different examples I kind of gave of, how do I probe? How do I do reconnaissance to avoid detection? And then we also have distributed, right? And now we're starting to see kind of attacks as a service, or distributed that beyond not just one attacker group, but multiple attacker groups to really, really hurt an organization, but also make it challenging for them to stop and block that. So it's very critical when you talk about real-time blocking to making sure you're monitoring each step of the attack. So correlating all the suspicious events that are potentially tied to that attacker, classifying those events to determine what's the severity, what's the risk to my business and my organization, and then making sure you have the full context and visibility into what's actually being executed. And that can potentially, most times not, actually rapidly reveal kind of the intentions of the attacker or what's going on within your environment. With that being said, a couple different things. So, just going over this one pretty quick. So when you're looking at platforms, when you're looking at how to implement the best solution, it's really, again, we talked a little bit about identifying a unique attacker, correlating that data over time. But I think, and this is kind of my theory when it comes to shift left and shift right. I think as an organization, as a industry in the last 6 to 18 months, we've really had this concept of shifting left. Right, shifting left, making sure we put SAST and DAST and scanning tools and misconfiguration technologies and being able to discover and catalog. Yes, that is, you're hearing it first from me. That is critically important for every organization to do that, right? And there's obviously all the benefits, and that's not my talk track today, but that's there's a lot of benefits of doing that, right? Obviously, it saves the organization more time in the end, more money, instead of like having vulnerable applications out there. But we can't forget that it's not 100% shifting left. We also have to remember that we need to look and get visibility into real-time APIs and applications of kind of what they're doing within our environment, right? And making sure that we can actually go and block. Again, for a CISO and having a security team under me, I don't want my team spending time trying to figure out how to prioritize, 80 API alerts that came in the last 5 seconds, right? I need a solution or a partner or a technology that I can either partner with or implement that can automate that and do that intelligently for me. And because it's at the end of the day, right, we've got 100 things going on, if not thousands of things going on. And yes, API security is very important, but I need solutions that can also make sure embed well in my organization, integrate with my other teams, are easy and effective to use, but are doing some of those things I talked about, like risk profiling and correlation. So while shift left is very critical and very important, it's also important that we're also not forgetting about the real-time blocking and kind of the incident response to API security. So kind of almost the last slide here. So again, I kind of talked about this, but again, it's, how do I block these API attacks in real time? There's a lot of complexity, right? This is not also an easy task to do. I think with a lot of this, right, it's, I think the best approach is kind of having that 1-2 punch. So it's using the metrics, analyzing that, identify what's being targeted, and then addition with that, how many unique attackers are actually hitting you? What are those tactics? It's not, again, always just focus on the shift left. And here's a perfect example. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but containers or runtime security, right? And so I think with that being said, we need to start to envision where are APIs actually embedded within my organizations. or organization, and who's using them, how are they using them, are we using them for containers, even though they might be private or only dedicated for my team. Sometimes they're not, right? And that's what we've seen with different security incidents and breaches. So I think with that, right, expanding the scope of how APIs are used, where they are, making sure we put real-time blocking capabilities, and of course, also doing a lot of the shift left stuff that I'm sure you've heard from other speakers and other technology partners. And so last slide, kind of a busy one, but really what I want to focus on here is this is just kind of a quick discovery or a quick, I like to call this my core key capabilities. So when it comes specifically to API security, finding a solution that can really hit these 4 to 5 pillars. And of course, this differs for everybody, right? Depending on the maturity of the organization, size, budgeting, resource allocation, this kind of fluctuates. But in an ideal scenario world, making sure I got a solution or product that can do some of that API discovery and analysis, right? We talked a lot about the shift left, but making sure I can be incorporated in that CI/CD pipeline, I can catalog, I know what's going on, not just, again, relying on schemas as well, but also different things around like endpoint risk scoring. From there, moving on to real-time analysis and response. And then also making sure that I can do things like some of those different things I talked about, like IP interrogation. You can see some of the things here that I kind of put my key capabilities: active deception, data flow analysis, real-time blocking, making sure that's integrated, right? Especially in this economic downturn coming in 23, 24, it's very difficult for me to go to the board and say, I need 5 different point solutions, right? I got 5 different technologies in there one's doing WAF, one's doing API, one's doing bot, one's doing fraud protection. How do I consolidate, right? We are in the world right now of consolidation, trying to figure out where do I best spend my time and resources and financial capabilities. So when I go to the board, I've got a very clear and distinguished ask of what I'm looking for. And so looking at and finding different solutions and companies out there that can provide the majority of these solutions to really help consolidate that effort is critical. And with that kind of being said, the last 2 are kind of, depending on the organization and depending on your environment, making sure you have flexible deployment options. We've got customers, and I've seen it, that I might have web applications in EMEA, and I might have to abide by different compliance regulations like GDPR, for example. Or maybe I have legacy solutions in my stack that are typically on premise or in the cloud or agentless. So making sure you have flexible deployment options for all companies is very, very critical. And last but not least, I will say, we kind of talked about with resource allocations, but if I can find a partner, it's not necessarily having a complete outsource, because a lot of organizations do have the capabilities to do this themselves, but making sure that I have a critical partner, because everything's about relationships, especially when picking vendors, right? A critical partner that is great at customer support, great at communication, and that can also do different things like potentially do rule creation or some of that instant response offloading, right? And so I think when you look at these 5 different key capabilities and core categories, feel free to take screenshots. I know there will be people here, but this is kind of how it all wraps up. When you're looking at a perfect security, what I like to at least call a more perfect security API solution, this is personally what I look for. So with that being said, I am actually going to turn it back over to Trish to do any Q&A or any final questions that we have here. But hopefully before I leave, this was very beneficial and kind of, a little probably different approach of not just shifting left, but how we can actually focus in some of the use cases on shifting right. So hopefully it was educational. And Trish, I will turn it back over to you. But Trish, I think you might be on mute. Yep, you might be on mute there. But I can actually check as you're figuring that out. I can also look at some of the wing it as well, and look at look at some of the different comments, and I think there's some.
You guys hear me?
There you go.
All right, cool. So that's better. I was having issues with my earbuds. So great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And, being in the blue track for this conference, we are all about, reacting to that event or defending against the threat actor. And so there was a question in the Q&A area for this from Vitautas. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. I do wonder about the automated tools. A few talks during this conference mentioned that the automated tools are useful for level 1 inspection, but are not very useful for a full pen test analysis. You've mentioned that you use these automated pen testing tools yourself. Is it to just make sure the lowest hanging fruit is covered, or do you find other great utilities for them? So great question from Vitautas.
Yeah, great question, Mike. in my past, it's so just kind of backing up a little bit. In my past, when it came to looking at, for example, just specifically pen testing, we would typically, when I worked for other organizations, we would typically outsource that to other third parties that were, let's call it, experts at pen testing. But it's like anything, right? When you get pen testing results, even if they're automated or not, to me, it still comes back to the business logic and the business use case of, do I need to fix everything? Can I fix anything? I think that's kind of the biggest thing as well. So I do think, Mike, to answer the specific questions, I think I was Mike to answer that. There are definitely benefits to it, but as you start to automate more, you start to dig in deeper, and this is kind of just like anything, there's a potential where you're going to find a lot more stuff, and who's going to be on the hook to go fix all that stuff, right? Or at least, I know a lot of times, in past companies I worked, more internal security, we had businesses that we want to do business with, and we had to hand over pen test results, right? And they interpret pen test results and kind of what they see on paper potentially very different than what we do. So I do think there are benefits to it, but I do think there's way more than just pen testing, right? There you can do so much more than just hiring somebody or doing some of these automated tools to really kind of get back down to that visibility, the ownership of those APIs as well.
No, that's a really great point. And you might find utilities that you didn't think about before by executing on them. So that's great. So apologies to everyone who's attending. Just noticed there's an actual Q&A section. So now I'm going to go through this. There's actually a question from Dabby Dabs from yesterday that you might be able to help us answer there, Jeremy. So what can aid in creating more realistic and effective training programs for new analysts? As you talked about the SOC piece of it and the afterwards, what obstacles specific to the organization are needed to be addressed towards improving methods so that we're not hit with that alert fatigue that we're also familiar with?
Yeah, I love that question. I could probably do a whole presentation on this. So I'll kind of break it up in a couple different things. I think, and I'll definitely give credit to, I know a lot of the speakers I'm good friends with and I've worked with and done podcasts in the past. I know Corey Ball, one of the keynote speakers, so shout out to Corey. But there was a lot of great, and it's starting to become, we definitely need more of it, Debbie, I think it's Debbie. And as we definitely need more training, more information out there. But there is some really, really solid stuff. I know Corey and his API University, another shout out to Tanya Janka, who does We Hack and She Hacks Purple. There's a lot of free training out there that we have, including the company that I work for, right? We've got something called the ThreatX Academy, which we do provide free kind of baseline training as well. So there's a lot of good information out there, but information is only useful as it's interpreted and as actually put into practice. And so to really answer the question, I think where you're going with this is, a lot of the times I've seen with organizations where they just it comes down to ownership a lot of times where people know API security. They may not know all the specifics about how to protect themselves and how to implement the right solutions around that stack. But it's a lot of, I always like to say, I've used this analogy before, but it's the Spider-Man meme. I'm not sure if everyone's seen that, where they all point at each other and like, who's responsible, right? That's a real thing within organizations we talk to. And trying to break those barriers down, it's difficult. It's not easy. And I think it comes back to, why is it not easy? It's because it's a people problem. It's a human problem, right? Who's going to take ownership? Who wants the accountability of that? Who has the most insight and most influential power to do that? So I definitely think, depending on the organization, like I know some I've worked where sometimes it's bringing development into those conversations, right? I've seen creative things like doing like lunch and learns, like 30-minute lunch and learns once a month of trying to just try to get the conversation started. Like, oh, development. Hey, by the way, this is your security team. Security, this is your development team. And like, kind of, what are you guys doing? And, like, how can we help you and how we protect? Like, starting to bring people to the table and to the conversation. And of course, you can go even a little bit more further advanced, and kind of goes back to Mike's original question about like pen testing, but I'll take that to the next level. If organizations have the resources and time to do this, which I highly recommend it, can you put them through tabletop exercises? So let's get everybody in sitting on the table for, it's hard, right, to take everybody out of their day jobs, especially with everyone's remote now, but going through tabletop or fire drills and saying, okay, we just had an API security incident breach. Now what? Go through the incident response playbook. Who's responsible? Who's doing what? Who needs to contact? So the more and more we can educate, the more and more we can kind of combine that, the better I think we all will be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you mentioned incident response playbooks, and that was kind of my next question. as we are talking about the response to it, so whether or not there's a technology that's alerting the SOC, or it's a series of flow and business process understanding alerts that get them attuned to something is going on with the API, or someone is taking advantage of information that can be pulled out of the API. I'm assuming before you get to the big incident response playbook, there should be a much smaller response to what's going on in that specific instance to validate that the traffic is actually happening. Can you give us a couple of best practices for those SOC teams that are putting together these playbooks for these kinds of attacks?
Yeah, another great. So I actually, a little background. I kind of mentioned it before. I pretty much started for a while. I worked for actually IBM X Force, and so I was on their Iris team creating incident response playbooks. I'll tell you the one thing that never came up, because it just nobody even was thinking about it 10 years ago, was APIs. So that's interesting. But I can imagine that conversation is not the same today. Hopefully not the same. People focus more on malware and phishing, and my CEO lost the laptop. What do I do? But you bring up a great point, Trish, there, where I think when it comes to best practices and tips, it's making sure, like, when you create those plans don't have to be, or processes, they don't have to be so long and like unfollowed. I couldn't tell you how many times I've walked in organizations and say, okay, let's see your incident response plan for phishing. They physically grab a notebook or like a binder and they go, here you go. And so then you're like, does anybody actually follow this? And 99 times out of 100, they don't, right? It's in everybody's head and their technical expertise and knowledge. So specifically when you're building kind of either micro playbooks or larger, kind of more involved incident response playbooks when it comes to APIs, I think making sure you're flexible. I think, Trish, you actually kind of mentioned it, but understanding and doing the validation right at the beginning of, and anyone can call it different, right? You can call it the engage phase. NIST's got all their like the identification and preparation phase. There's all different names for it, but those first couple stages, what you want to do is really understand what is the API, what is the application, who owns it, what does normal look like again, and again, just because normal might be 5,000 requests per second, but now you're in the holiday season, like a retailer, and now you're at 50,000, is that normal? So making sure you can track and correlate history and information over time. From there, it obviously takes characteristics and detailing. So I talked a lot about correlating that attack pattern. So are we seeing, a lot of times solutions will like see an IP address and then they forget about it. And then 6 months later, that IP address came back again. Right? Unless you're actually feeding your solutions to like a SIM or a log correlator, there's sometimes no way to actually go back. And so I think having the right it's not even all about technology, but having the right processes in place where you can do some of the historical lookup and data fast, right? I think that's the other thing. When you're in an incident, breathe, but you got to move pretty fast depending on how severe this is. And so making sure you do the tabletops, making sure you have that plan that's flexible, where maybe this one specific task doesn't work for us. It's okay. Move on to the next one, right? Move on. Keep building those playbooks or even micro playbooks when something kind of unusual happens.
Very cool. Very cool. And, incident response is very near dear to my heart, as it's kind of what I do as my day job when I'm not emceeing conferences. But when we talk about getting developer involvement, and this kind of is harkening back to a question that was asked yesterday from Edwin about how do you garner, what are some tactics to getting more of that developer engagement and that adoption of it? Do you see more and more of your clients or the folks that you work with having developers at the table during an incident response?
I will say this: the more prepared and mature organizations, yes.
Okay.
But it's again, it's not as easy. Of course, I could sit here and be like, yeah, get your developers in and do a tabletop. I think we all know that it's way easier said than done. And I think sometimes it's, again, educating, bringing them to the table, giving them a voice. I think that's also super, super huge. It's not just security coming down and be like, nope, we're slowing you down. We're putting all these testing tools in place, and you can't get your job done. As developers and engineering, just historically, the main focus is not security. It's how do I produce? How do I produce? How do I go through these sprints, for example, and get the code out, get the product out? And as security, we need to also be careful of how we kind of come into that world as well. And I think there's more and more trainings that are coming up, but we can't. The one thing is we can't come in hot. I always say that. I've seen the worst security teams come in hot, and they're like, nope, development, nope, you guys are doing this wrong. We're putting all these tools in place, and they're like, whoa, like we still have a job to do too. Like, they get paid to create code and produce code.
Yeah.
Security, our job is to secure and maintain that business operation. And the more and more we can combine, obviously we've seen acronyms like DevSecOps, DevOps. I know I mentioned it in the presentation.
Mhm.
Again, the more mature you typically, and I hate using that word maturity, but really it is, the more mature the organizations are, you're starting to see a lot of good progress, but we still have a long way to go. So making sure we give them a voice, bring it to the table, make sure we're not slowing them down. That's the other big thing too. Like, they still have their agenda and what they're good at and what they want to do for work. And so I think it's a combination of a couple little things in there. But again, I've seen lunch and learns work. I've seen tabletops. I've seen just doing kind of like, bring in, if you have a CISO, bring the CISO and have them be quiet and sit in a development sprint cycle to see how they talk and how they work. There's so many different simple things that organizations can do. They just don't. And that connection sometimes can be very, very far apart.
Absolutely. And I know that communication can often be disconnected. A lot of teams feel it's very tempting to fall into the us and them, kind of tug of war when it comes to dev and security, when really there needs to be more cohesion in that regard. And so kind of my final point, unless anybody has any other questions that they want to ask in the chat, just going to quickly look again. So, looking from the analyst perspective, there's a lot that they have to learn as first time and as entry level security people. So everything from application security to network security to various types of authentication to keeping up with all the malware techniques and all of that stuff. What is a really easy way for them to get involved in understanding API when they've already got so much on their plate from a SOC analyst perspective?
Yeah, I think from an analyst perspective, I think a lot of it is I know what's helped me personally. Kind of more of a tip is being curious, and I think doing some research and reading. I'm a big podcast reading kind of individual where I'll just type in API security incidents or breaches or things I don't even know, like cryptocurrency, Bitcoin mining. Right, I'm not an expert in that, so I can't speak on that. But like, I'm interested and curious on that stuff. And so the more and more you can educate, the more and more you can do things like attending an API secure conference or, reaching out to local communities. There's so many different events out there, regionally, locally, internationally, that in trainings I mentioned before, like the more you can educate, the more you can kind of embellish more of an understanding, the better you will be in no matter what that is. That's my true belief. When it comes specifically though for API security, I kind of mentioned some of the different trainings, conferences. Again, reaching over the table, and maybe it's setting up a past company, we used to call these things I think it was called like coffee donut dates, and it was 30 minutes every 2 weeks, and you got to be matched up with somebody from a different organization, and you could request like, oh, if I'm a SOC analyst, maybe I want to sit down for 30 minutes, just get to know the individual who handles, for example, our API gateway, because maybe it's not a security responsibility in this organization. And so just asking some of the questions like, how can I help you? What can you do? What can you do to help me in a situation? How would we work together? So a lot of it sounds like more fundamental, basic human things, but a lot of it actually, technology changes. Technology has already changed since I started this presentation. My product has probably already changed since I started this presentation. And so how do we stay advanced? It's difficult, but I think opening those conversations up, having those conversations as an analyst, being curious, doing different things like attending conferences like this, different trainings will only help you.
I love it. And it always feels like there's more to learn in this industry. And at least for some of us, myself included, that's kind of why we're in it, right? And I tell people all the time, if you're not excited to learn about this when you're not doing your 9 to 5, then find what your heart takes you to, because there is a lot to figure out here. And while API and a lot of the techniques that we've heard about in the Red Track have been available for some time, we as security practitioners on the blue side are only really seeing the impact and implications of this recently, right? And so while it's been theorized by the folks that are trying to break things in the other room, there certainly hasn't been a whole lot of practical hands-on until very recently, when you've got the breaches that you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for your insights. 1 minute to go here, but tell us how we can reach out to you.
Absolutely, and I appreciate it again. Thank you, Trish, for being a great moderator, MC, and again, Apisecure. Thanks for having me and having ThreatX be a sponsor of this as well. Hope it was very educational for everybody. I was looking through the comments as well. Awesome questions, awesome insight in there, and that's exciting, right? I think it makes me hopeful and optimistic that we are getting better as an industry, because sometimes we can be very sometimes pessimistic or down on ourselves, right? Because to your point, there's always so much to learn. So super exciting, but people can reach out to me. LinkedIn, you've got my name, Jeremy Ventura. In addition to that, I also just announced last week that I do have a new podcast out. So we'll have our first episode next week called Exploring Cybersecurity, and we're going to be covering all different topics. And that's kind of the whole thing as well. So be on the lookout for that. And then as well, ThreatX.com and our blogs, so you'll see me regularly on there, and some interesting stuff about kind of what we're doing and how we're looking at kind of the world of API security as well. So again, thank you, Trish. Thank you, Apisecure.
Thank you.
It's been a true pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeremy.